I'm pleased to have with us today Dmitri Alperovitch. We're going to talk a lot about cybersecurity and the future, but before I introduce Dmitri, I'd like to underscore that if we will have cyber lives, as we will, we must have cybersecurity. But issues like these should not be left to chance. We need to make sure that we think about them hard in advance and manage as things evolve, because obviously we can't tell exactly how they're going to roll out. So we should have a sense for what our parameters are, what our demands and interests are, what's in our best interests as we co-evolve into this future space. With this, I'm so pleased to introduce Dmitri Alperovitch to the stage. Dmitri has been in the center of this flow since the early 2000s, and we'll come back to how he ended up in the cybersecurity space. But as many of you know, he's a co-founder and former CTO of Crowdstrike, one of the world's leading cybersecurity organizations, and has also been involved in many other essential challenges, such as early investigations into the Chinese activities online, and of course the break-in by nefarious actors of the Democratic National Committee servers, a rather well-known story these days. With this, I bring to the stage Dmitri Alperovitch. Dmitri.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, good to see you. So Dmitri, I think we met 4 or 5 years ago in Jackson Hole originally, and at that time Crowdstrike was a thing, but it was pretty early. Let's go back even earlier than that. How'd you get started in the cybersecurity thing? Were you just a weird kid, or I mean, what caused you to go this direction?
I probably was a weird kid, but there's a little bit of an atypical story. A lot of people that got started in this industry early on were hackers and were dabbling sort of in the dark side. So I never did. But my dad was a nuclear physicist in Russia, working on nuclear power plants. And when we immigrated to the United States, he couldn't get a job in the nuclear industry for obvious reasons. Nuclear industry in this country was pretty much dead at that point. So he was just working as a programmer, but kind of keep himself motivated and interested, kind of give him his mind an exercise. He started studying cryptography. And in those days, early 90s, that was really just the beginning of the use of commercial cryptography and the use of advanced mathematics to really understand how to build and break encryption. And he got interested in it, and we started a company together when I was still in high school, help him out. He was mostly interested.
So you started a company with your dad when you were in high school?
Yeah.
And you were like getting him coffee or stuff, or I mean, what were you doing?
No, I was actually doing a lot of the business side of it and helping him to develop the code as well. It wasn't the Crowdstrike success, but it did okay. And it really is what got me interested in security, because I realized early on that no matter how good your encryption algorithms are, it doesn't matter if someone else steals your keys. And it's all about this cat and mouse game of breaking into systems and getting access to secrets and manipulating information. And that got me even more interested in it, because the math was cool, but this chess game of move, counter move with adversaries was much more fascinating.
Great. So then fast forward, you did a few degrees, you got serious about this, and then Crowdstrike came along. So tell us a little bit about how that came together.
Yeah, so that was two plus decades after I'd already been in the industry, been part of startups, been part of big companies. And my prior job to Crowdstrike, I was running threat research and investigations at a company called McAfee, one of the big behemoths in cybersecurity. And in 2010, January of 2010, get a call from this little company called Google that had just discovered an intrusion into their systems and started working that case. We identified numerous other companies who were impacted by the same threat actors and ultimately traced it to China. And it was the first time people sort of set up and took notice that you had a nation state, not a criminal organization, not some hackers operating out of their parents' basements, but a military and intelligence service of another country that was breaking into private networks. And it was the first sort of big groundbreaking event. I named it Operation Aurora. And that led me to really start thinking that the problem was very different from what the industry was identifying, that you had to fundamentally shift the way you operate in order to defeat well-funded, highly capable teams of thousands of people in other countries that are now going after private industry. And that was really the impetus in CrowdStrike.
Right. Well, we'll come back to this issue of geopolitics and civil rights and on all of that and how it relates to cybersecurity. But before we do, what's something? I mean, CrowdStrike has been every entrepreneur's dream in terms of how it's gone, especially in the past year or so. But it wasn't an overnight success. I mean, there was a lot of work that went into making that happen. Tell us a little. You said there was a moment when it wasn't even clear that you guys were gonna keep things moving. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, that's right. It took us 10 years to really build it out into the huge success that it is now. And success is never a straight line. There are ups and downs, sometimes on the same day. But one of the things that's been really interesting to observe is how in the early days, there were so many doubters. There were so many people saying this will never work. We were doing for the first time a cloud-based security system. And at the time, people said, you can't trust the cloud. The cloud is, a joke. At the time, Amazon was just really early on in their journey, and few people were using them. And particularly when we're meeting with big financial institutions, we're telling them about our system. They said, this is great, but we will never use it because it's in the cloud. And years later, they're all customers. And the funny thing is that at the time, all of our competitors were saying, you can't trust CrowdStrike, their cloud-based system. 5 or 6 years later, they were all touting how they're a cloud-based system as well. So, perseverance is key. Don't listen to doubters. If you believe in something, keep pursuing that vision, and know that eventually all the doubters will turn around and say that what you did was really obvious in retrospect.
That's generally good advice, but I also have to point out that for all the CrowdStrikes and Dmitri Alperoviches, there are thousands of other people who stuck to their guns who failed. So, so there's that as well. Just for fun, what is your favorite anecdote from the history of CrowdStrike? And it doesn't even have to be relevant. Big points for humor.
Yeah. So we started the company in September of 2011, and we raised $25 million, which at the time was incredible amount of money. I guess it still is even now, but we raised it literally on a PowerPoint slide. We had about 25 slides actually, and we joked there was $1 million per slide. We should have made more slides. But I got the team together, and we literally we practiced remote working before that was a thing, and before people really realized that you could do this efficiently. So I believe from the get-go that it was really critical to hire the best people wherever they are. So the first people that we hired that I brought on board, 10 people, were in 5 countries, 5 states and 2 countries. So everyone was completely distributed. And I hired them literally over the phone, we didn't have Zoom at that point yet. It was Skype calls and what have you. And we got them all together. I brought them all to New York to really figure out how we're going to build this new technology. So we spent a couple of days in New York, and I wanted to have, this was the first time people were meeting each other. I want to have a team building exercise. So I told one of my guys who's actually from New York, saying, listen, let's go out on Long Island. Let's get a boat, do a nice event on the boat. Wasn't thinking that this was late September, hurricane season in New York City. But I told him, get a boat. And by the way, one of the things that's really important is for us to, even though we raise this much money, but we want to be frugal, and we want to show that we're not just going to be spending money on massages and all the stuff that different value companies get in trouble with. So I said, here's your budget. It was a pretty low budget, but get us a nice boat. At the same time, I was courting this amazing guy, Alex Ionescu, who was one of the game-changing hires for us. I knew that we really needed to land this guy if we wanted to build some cutting-edge technology. So I was courting him for weeks before we got started, and he was starting to lean our way. And I said, to close you, why don't you fly to New York? You'll meet the whole team. Bring your wife. We'll take you out on this boat. It'll be an amazing experience. So we go out to Long Island. He meets us there on the dock. And, I'm expecting to see a yacht, champagne, caviar. And that's certainly what he's expecting. What we found is a boat called Captain Lou.
Captain Lou,
a fishing boat. As dirty as you can imagine a fishing boat is. We get on it. Instead of caviar and champagne, there's literally like some chips and M&Ms. And we take off, and there's literally 6-foot swells that start crushing onto the deck of the boat. I turn around and I'm looking sort of inward, and my chief architect, who was outside, walks in completely drenched. And one of my guys says, "Oh my God, we almost just lost our chief architect. He almost got washed away." The wife of Alex that came over, the guy I was recruiting, just locked herself in the bathroom the entire time, would not come out. So we finally get back to shore a couple hours later. So we get back to the dock. We're walking back to land, and I turn around to Alex and I say, "So are you ready to sign, or do you go back on the boat?"
And he signed.
He signed.
So the upside is you picked up Alex. The downside was you had to look for a new event planner.
Exactly. Yeah. From that point forward, the guy that was running our Intel team that planned this event was not allowed to plan events anymore.
Well, good for you. Let's shift back to cybersecurity in general. And you've brought up geopolitical threats. You mentioned 2010 and the investigation into the Chinese. And I want to underscore for people that was 10 years ago. It's making me feel old for sure. But a lot has changed in that time. So what are the most significant risks, do you think, from a geopolitical context as warfare, not necessarily warfare, but conflicts of various sorts, port online?
Well, I think the most critical point to understand now is that cyber is forever linked with geopolitics. And I like to say that we actually don't have a cybersecurity problem. We have a China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea problem. Because even though not every attack comes from those nation states, the vast majority of attacks that we see, even when they're pure cybercrime, originate from individuals operating inside of those countries. We obviously have seen that from Russia over the last 2 decades. We now have seen in the recent indictments from Justice Department how the Chinese are recruiting cyber criminals to facilitate their state objectives. We have seen North Koreans engage in criminal activity as well as Iranians. So a lot of the cybercrime activity is actually coming from those countries because they're shielding those individuals. Certainly, they don't have the monopoly on cybercrime, but the difference is that in other countries, those individuals are quickly identified, caught, and prosecuted. So you don't have this opportunity to build up complex networks, organizational networks of sophisticated criminal enterprises, but you do in those countries. So similarly to the way the mafia evolved in Sicily in the 1800s because of a lack of enforcement and the weak power of the government in Italy at the time, and you built up these behemoth organizations that are now sort of difficult to disrupt. You have the same thing taking place online in Russia, China, and other countries because they're able to operate with impunity, and in fact, in many cases, supported by the state. So it really comes down to how do we deal with those 4 countries, both from what they're doing to us from a state perspective, as well as from the fact that they're encouraging, enabling, or shielding criminal organizations operating within their borders.
So those criminals to us are assets to them, to these other 100%. Nations.
Absolutely. What we see, and Russia really pioneered this. They started identifying those criminals that are operating within Russian borders. They started arresting them. But then suddenly you saw a month later those individuals getting out of prison and disappearing. And what we learned later is that they were actually given a choice. Do you want to spend 10 years in a camp in Siberia, or do you want to go work for the government? And by the way, when you work for the government, you'll wear the uniform. You'll conduct objectives of our government during the daytime. And what you do at night is your business. And if you want to engage in cybercrime on the side, to help pay the bills and more.
Well, that's concerning. What can we do about it?
I think it's all about how do we solve our relationships with these countries? How do we use all means of our power, diplomatic, certainly economic, and military if need be, to make it very clear to them that this will not be tolerated. And so far, we have not yet figured out the right levers to push on with these countries to make it clear to them that the cost of doing this is higher than the benefits that they're receiving.
what are some things we should know about and be paying attention to, say, over the next 7 to 10 years?
In 2010, about 10 years ago, really we started entering this new phase, the third generation, as I call it, where we're now dealing with disruptive and destructive attacks. So the most destructive attacks we've ever seen took place a few years ago with the NotPetya attack, which wasn't even targeted at the West, but caused billions of dollars in damage because it was the Russian military intelligence, the GRU, that had hacked the DNC in 2016. But this time they were targeting Ukraine. They wanted to destroy infrastructure of companies in Ukraine through a pretty novel attack, but it spread beyond Ukraine and hit companies all over the globe. So those are the types of things that we're starting to see more of, attacks on critical infrastructure. The Russians have targeted the power grid in Ukraine on a couple of occasions. We saw a very sophisticated attack on a refinery in Saudi Arabia about a year and a half ago. So those are the types of attacks that I would pay a lot of attention to. We often focus on theft of data, the Equifax type of hacks, but the more dangerous stuff is yet to come, where we could have physical impacts, we could have huge impacts on operations of critical infrastructure as a result of these operations.
So Dmitri, is the fact that these kinds of more dangerous attacks, the physical harm that you're talking about, not happening as that much, is it more because of the restraint of the bad actors?
There are a couple of answers to that. One, those are very, very sophisticated attacks. So luckily, very few countries are capable of orchestrating them today. Also, a number of systems in critical infrastructure are still relatively disconnected from the internet, so they would require physical access to actually perpetrate it. That is changing rapidly. In fact, due to COVID, more and more of that infrastructure is becoming remotely connected to allow people to manage it from home. So we're increasing those vulnerabilities. And the third element, of course, is that you don't just launch cyber attacks because you can. You need to have a strategic reason for doing so. And luckily, even the Russians, even the Chinese, don't want to get into a hot conflict with the United States at this point. So there is a great deal of deterrence that we have today vis-a-vis those countries, because they know if they take down our grid, we're not just going to respond to sanctions. That will likely be treated as an act of war, and that's not going to be good for them either. So we still have, I think, quite a bit of deterrence against those countries. Now, of course, as we perhaps get into more and more troubled relations with Iran, for example, they may be a lot less deterred if we're hitting them.
Great. Well, it's a topic we could talk about for a while, but it's actually a topic related to Silverado Policy Accelerator. So you announced earlier this year, right before the crisis hit, that you were stepping down from your role at Crowdstrike and you were starting a new policy accelerator to help with these questions in Washington and beyond. First of all, tell us about Silverado and make sure to explain what the heck a policy accelerator is. It sounds great, but what is it?
Absolutely. So the concept behind the policy accelerator is that there's a lot of great ideas out here in Washington, D.C. and across the country that never actually get put into practice. You look at the return on investment of a lot of these organizations. They're generating ideas, they're generating reports. Very few of them ever get taken up by administrations, by Congress, because they're not well set up to push those efforts. They publish a report and then they move on, and you need a continuous campaign to push an issue to actually make sure that it gets adopted by policymakers. So the goal of the Policy Accelerator is really to take a venture approach to policy, to start looking at great ideas that are sort of at seed stage right now and invest in those ideas to try to get them to, quote unquote IPO implementation in the government realm. And we're looking to do this in cyber policy, in trade, as well as geopolitics, so that we can actually try to solve some of the fundamental issues we face in this country on a bipartisan basis, but trying to get some consistent campaigns to get people to look at new ideas that are out there on these issues.
So you mentioned cybersecurity, also trade, and so this transcends the cyber realm.
Correct. So this is something that our new executive director and my wife are both passionate about. They have trade negotiator backgrounds, and they're very much interlinked, because if you look at cyber, a lot of what we're dealing with today, aside from the destructive attacks, is economic warfare. What China is doing to us is really not IP theft. They're waging trade warfare against us through cyber means, like stealing all of this intellectual property and giving it to their domestic sector to enable that sector to better compete against us on the global stage. So trade needs to be part of the conversation. In fact, if you look at the trade war that the Trump administration had started against China, it was started because of what's known as a 301 regulation that USTR, U.S. Trade Representative, had passed that enabled them to institute these tariffs against China. And why did they do that? The cause is the IP theft that the Chinese have been engaged in.
Right, which has been well known and very significant for many years. So it was a long time coming to attempt to address that. And I would say it will be better for both the Chinese and the Americans if we figure that out over the next few years, because otherwise it comes to a head. But I do want to clarify something, though. You said something really interesting, and that is you're an engineer who married a trade negotiator. I'm going to have to guess that you don't win many arguments at home.
Oh, absolutely. It's right. She wins every argument. I really view Silverado as Crowdstrike 2.0. I've always had a passion for policy. In fact, when I was studying cybersecurity in college 20 years ago, I took a ton of courses in international affairs, almost got a major in it, but was always passionate about the issue. And then went into the cyber industry thinking I'd never use that knowledge again. And lo and behold, Google hack happens, and I'm dragged into DC to help the State Department to brief people on the National Security Council and the Situation Room. And that has continued pretty much nonstop over the last 10 years. And I always believe that the way we solve these issues is both through technology, which I try to do with CrowdStrike, but also policy. So I'm coming back to the policy piece with Silverado having, in many ways, addressed it with technology.
Well, I'd love to talk to you more. I know you just officially launched Silverado this month, so maybe in a way this is the big coming out party for Silverado. I'd love to talk about maybe Twin can do something with you guys, share what you're doing, maybe see if any of our Twinians are interested in being engaged with this. And I'm particularly excited about Silverado because of your effort to be bipartisan. These days in this polarized world, it seems almost impossible to bring these sides together. But somebody's got to try really hard, because if we don't solve that, then we don't get anywhere good. So yeah. We'd love to be with you on that journey.
Thanks, Mark.
So 10 years from now, there's a tweet storm about you. Now, I should share with everybody, this would mean yet another tweet storm about Dmitri, but set that aside. 10 years from now, there's a tweet storm about you, and you're actually happy about it. What is it?
Well, God, if there is another tweet storm, and I hope there isn't, but if there is, I hope it's about something like my preference for plaid jackets and the fashion trend that I started in cybersecurity with related to that.
So is that is plaid jacket your thing in the cyber world?
These are my signature jackets, yes.
Okay. Well, you heard it here. Maybe you can launch a line of signature jackets too. I'm sure those will go over big with at the work from home engineers who really need to up their style game. During your conversation about early days in building CrowdStrike, you mentioned the best people 3 times in a rather short conversation. So it really wasn't about the technology so much, it was about the best people you could find, regardless of where they were in the world. So even before the rest of us got thrust across the digital Rubicon, our theme for TwinTech 2020, you and your colleagues had already waded across the river and were well on the way to Rome. And I'm glad you guys were on the way there in front of us because it makes us all a little bit safer in this journey. You mentioned the game-changing hire, for instance. I think that's how we have to think about our businesses, not so much about technology or markets. They're all important, but about the people that we bring in, the people that we work with. This success thing is never a straight line, and I dare say, unfortunately, neither will be this 3rd generation of attacks and what might come in the future. The economic warfare that we're entering into, it's really not just about stealing people's data. It's also about the relationships between individuals, groups, communities, and nations, as it has been for centuries. It reminds me of, I modestly say, my ancestor, Sir Francis Drake, back many centuries ago in the United Kingdom. The British, the English knew him, of course, as a privateer and a hero, and the Spanish knew him as a pirate. And so Drake was exactly the sort of fellow, maybe a little bit more honorable than the people you're talking about now. But you know what? History doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly does rhyme. Dimitri, thanks again so much for being with us. I can't wait to see where Silverado goes and to be a small part of that journey.
Thank you, Robert.